Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at Morphe's, and we're taking a look at a rifle that is the subject of a whole bunch of controversy and bad information. This is a Single-Rune bnz43 K98k. In other words, this is a Steyr-produced SS Contract Mauser K98k rifle. So let me start at the beginning a little bit here with the SS. It is, of course, founded as the armed wing of the Nazi Party. It starts off basically just as a small group of armed bodyguards for the nascent beginning of the Nazi Party. And as the party grows in stature and popularity and power, the SS grows in size and prominence and importance. And by the time we get to 1939, the SS has tens of thousands of armed members, and it's sort of a parallel, not a shadow military, but it's a second military force that exists alongside the actual official German armed forces at the time, the Wehrmacht, the army. And there's a lot of bad blood between these two organizations. The army really generally does not like the idea of these armed political goons running around. Well, the SS has the ear of the party leadership, and anyway, what is relevant for today's video is the fact that the SS, until like 1940, the SS had its own independent organizational tables, and its arms were procured independently. The SS did not begin as an arm of the German military. It wasn't able to just go to German army depots and issue weapons. It had to supply all of its own weapons. And so in the 1930s, you will see the SS supplied with a bunch of sort of oddball stuff that they got here and there. When the Anschluss with Austria happened and then the takeover of Czechoslovakia, you would see a lot of SS contracts for, in particular, Czech weapons that, like, these things kind of become available now that the Germans are controlling many parts of the Czech arms industry. Earlier on, the SS would take older World War I era rifles, Gewehr 98s, and they would modify them and update them to K98k pattern. Those, by the way, are the guns where you will see the death's head markings, and those things are a really huge nightmare of fakes and fraud and all sorts of difficulty in verification because there aren't a whole lot of hard and fast rules as to how they were done. By 1940, the SS gets its sort of the TO&E, the Table of Organization and Equipment, is standardized with the German Army to make things easier to integrate. By a little later on in the war, the SS would end up being merged with the Army supply, but the SS always sort of remains a little bit aloof. And where this comes into play is in June of 1943, when the Steyr company signs a contract with the SS to produce rifles specifically directly for the SS outside of any Army production lines. Now, there's a reason they're able to do this. You'd think all of the production facilities are going to be, like the Army's going to get first dibs on arms production, and that is true. What happens here is in 1942, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, gets the idea to run this new plan where they're going to monetize their concentration camps. The conundrum he has is he's got all of these prisoners, and they cost money to feed to the extent that they do feed them, but they don't get anything out of them. So how can we monetize this? How can we fix this situation? And the answer is, the SS will rent concentration camp labor to the German arms industry. So the arms companies can get cheap labor to make guns for the military, and the SS can get some money, because who doesn't like money? And that's where this comes from. So in March of 1943, Steyr sets up, or begins to set up, a rifle production line at the SS camp, or just, well, associated with the SS camp of Gusen. This is essentially a sub-camp of the Mauthausen concentration camp facility, and they're enticed to set up a new production line there. And in June, so just a couple months after they start setting it up, they sign a contract specifically with the SS to produce 10,000 rifles a month. These are guns that are not associated with the Wehrmacht. So as I think I've already said like 3 times probably. But what that means is that a lot of the procedures are a little bit different. So the SS contract rifles don't go through the German Army inspection program. We're used to seeing on German Army rifles that Waffenamt, the WAA and the number under the eagle with the swastika, that's their inspection stamp. Well, those inspectors are all part of the Army, and the SS doesn't have them, and so these rifles produced specifically for the SS don't have any of those inspection markings. Now, this works, this whole production line thing actually works for Steyr and for the SS for about 15 months. So the contract is signed in June, Steyr starts to spool up production, and the issue that they have initially, of course, they have to, they want to start putting together rifles as quickly as possible, but some parts come together faster than others. The receivers in particular are a complicated part to manufacture, and it's one of the things that takes the longest for them to actually get up in production at the new Gusen plant. And so they end up bringing in a lot of receivers from other Steyr manufacturing facilities, in particular the factory in Radom in Poland, which is under Steyr management, I suppose you could say at the time. And those receivers that are coming in from other plants are not going through the same inspection procedures, the same QC procedures as the Army guns, and so they're specifically marked with a single S rune to indicate that they are SS, they're bound for this specific SS contract, and that is where the Single-Rune guns come from. So let's take a closer look at this one and let me show you what the specific characteristics of these Single-Rune guns are, and then we'll talk about why they ended up going away. All right, so this is a K98k, so the most important first thing we're going to look at are the receiver markings. BNZ here is the German Ordnance System code for Steyr at this point in the war. Early on they were 660, then they went to BNZ. And it's important to recognize that this was used for multiple different Steyr plants. If the plant was owned by Steyr, BNZ was the code. So the Gusen production, camp production stuff was BNZ. The stuff from Radom in Poland was also BNZ, and the stuff from Steyr's main factory in Austria was BNZ. We have a year code down here. You will find these marked 43 and 44 and just 4. They use that. Just 4 is 1944. And then, of course, this is the Single-Rune that the name indicates, the Single-Rune contract, etc. Now, a lot of people think that that rune means that this is an SS contract rifle. And that's both correct and a misunderstanding at the same time. So this production line at Gusen was only making guns for the SS, at first at least, during this period that we're looking at here. And so there was no need for them to distinguish SS guns from anything else. The runes are there on parts that were actually brought into Gusen from other production plants. So in particular, early in production, receivers were hard to tool up. Gusen couldn't make enough of its own receivers, and so they had to supplement them with production from other Steyr factories. Those other factories would mark receivers and other parts that they sent to Gusen with that SS rune to indicate that they were going through a different sequence of QC checks to indicate that they were headed for this SS contract. So the receivers that were actually manufactured at Gusen will not have this rune. It's only, essentially, it's only the backup or replacement or supplemental parts that got this. And you will also sometimes see that rune on pieces like the rear sight that also had to be brought in to supplement Gusen's own production from time to time. Now, that being said, because rune equals SS, SS equals money, money equals people are going to fake these guns and do quite a lot. So let's look at the other elements that you can expect to see on a real one. First off, there is no letter suffix on the serial number. German Army guns have a letter suffix, and they'd go out to like 9999 and then add an alpha, and then when they got to 9999A, they'd go to B and then C, etc., etc. The SS didn't have, I suppose, as strict of a record-keeping necessity, and so the SS guns will go up to 10,000 or 9999, and then they just loop back over to 1 again. So it's actually fairly difficult to track the specific production timelines of these SS contract guns because there are a lot of duplicate serial numbers out there, but this is very important. No suffix. There are also no WAA inspection marks on the receiver. Now, in this particular case, we have one on the barrel, and that's because this is a barrel that came off of a production line essentially, again, to supplement Gusen's own production. And that's a known thing that did happen. If you see a WAA, an Army inspection stamp on the receiver of a Gusen gun, something's been faked. It's not right. So we have a final inspection proof there, which is the eagle with the swastika, but there's no number under it. There's no Army Inspector Office that's associated with it. We do have mod 98 on the side rail here. That's normal. On the Army production guns, like every single little part is going to be serialized. In particular here on an Army gun, an official Army K98k, we'd have a serial number here on this striker housing. The SS guns are only serialized on the bolt and the safety out of these bolt components. Now, they were also serialized on the trigger guard down here. A little bit later on, they would start serializing the magazine floor plate, but this one is earlier and it doesn't have that. Army guns will have serial numbers on the nose cap and the barrel band. The SS Contract ones do not, and this one does not. And then there would also be serial numbers on the handguard and the stock on the inside. Now, this particular rifle has a replacement stock, and I know that because I opened it up and I looked at the stock and the serial number is mismatched. But I can also look here on the side of the butt, and we have a Waffenamt inspection stamp, WAA655. That tells me, again, this is an Army production stock. It's not one of the SS production stocks. Now, when exactly this stock was swapped onto the gun, I have no idea. Was it during the war? Was it after? There's no way for me to tell. But the stock is not the original stock that was produced on this gun. All right, a couple other things I think are worth mentioning here. First off, the original idea was that these guns could be essentially made entirely with prison camp labor, with concentration camp labor. And it would be super cheap to do, and you wouldn't have to have any real experts. That didn't work. You did, in fact, need to have industrial and armaments industry experts, people with specialized education, to do some of the work involved in making small arms like this. And so the production line at Gusen was supplemented by civilians who had the relevant technical skills where necessary. This same thing applies to the concentration camp production lines that were set up by Gustloff at the Buchenwald camp and by Walther at the Neuengamme camp. Both of those companies were looking to make K43s or G43s with concentration camp inmate labor, and it didn't really work out there either. They also had Sabotage. Now, there appears to have been more Sabotage of the K43 lines for Gustloff and Walther than there was for the K98k production line at Gusen. That seems to just be because mostly of the way that it was organized, as well as the 98K is a little harder of a gun to sabotage. A lot of the K43 sabotage was done to the gas port area. And it's just like there is no gas port that you can deliberately make a little bit wrong in a way that's not visually distinguishable but will prevent the rifle from working. K98K is a little harder to mess up. So there was some sabotage at Gusen, but it doesn't appear to have ever been a particularly substantial issue for the Germans. Also, for Steyr, this SS contract was an opportunity to make use of some parts that had already been rejected by the German army. So there were a lot of basically non-functional rejections of parts. If something wasn't quite machined right, even if it fit fine, even if it was just a cosmetic blemish, the Waffenamt would reject it out of hand. Like, that is totally not acceptable for an army rifle. The SS didn't care or didn't recognize the difference. And so Steyr used this opportunity to actually make use of a bunch of parts that it had lying around in scrap bins from its German army production lines. And so on these Single-Rune guns, as well as, of course, on the non-Rune total, Gusen production, what's generally called the SS Contract guns, you will find parts that have issues sometimes. I've seen credible examples, like authentic examples of these rifles that have, for example, bolts taken off of earlier Austrian production rifles, G12/34 rifles, that are essentially K98K actions, but with a few little subtle differences. And you will occasionally find those on these SS Contract guns, because, hey, if you've already got the part, why not make use of it rather than throw it away? If the SS isn't going to care or isn't going to notice that you've done it, well, there you go, why not? So the idea that the SS would have its own dedicated production line worked through early 1944. And then there started to be a couple of events that would start to push the Gusen production line back towards being integrated with regular Army logistics. So first off, in February of 1944, the main Steyr plant was hit by a significant heavy bombing raid, and large parts of it were taken offline, and that forced the Gusen plant to be used to backfill parts production for other contracts. So that would start to reduce the number of guns that it could supply specifically to the SS. More substantially, however, in September of 44, the Russians occupied the Radom plant in Poland. That was a major production facility for Steyr, and when they lost it, now guns that had been going to the Wehrmacht were no longer available, and within a month, this SS contract for Gusen is canceled. October of 44, that contract is canceled. The Wehrmacht basically looks at this and going, all right, we tolerated this while we could get guns from other sources, but now that the Radom plant's gone, no more special treatment for the SS. Those guns are going to become standard Wehrmacht supply items. And so in October of 44, we see the Gusen plant start to adopt all the regular inspection protocols and produce rifles that are sent into, like, they're used in general by the Wehrmacht. So these Single-Rune guns, as I said, you will see with the bnz43 and 44 receiver markings only. Once you get any later into the war, then October of 44, this special sort of batch of guns has disappeared. There's more to say about what happens with Gusen, but it's, I think, a little too detailed for this particular video, how the little minutia of parts from there incorporate into the rest of Steyr's general rifle production. Anyway, hopefully I have been able to shed a little bit of light here on what is otherwise something that I think is widely, poorly understood, often faked. It's cool to get a chance to take a look at one like this that is totally legit, except for the replacement stock, but all of the markings on it they're a really good example of what an early Single-Rune gun ought to be, and talk about what the truth is behind them, where they came from. So big thanks to Morphes for giving me access to this particular one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.